So we're going to be dividing this presentation in half. So I'm going to give the first half of the presentation, and then Guilherme is going to give the second half. But then Noel and Ivar are also both here. So maybe during question time, if they have a few questions, they can sort of pipe in to answer these questions. So we're going to be talking today about research on purposes, on the idea that certain things can be for something or have a certain kind of purpose. So this kind of topic of purposes, has been studied independently in two really different research traditions. On one hand, there's this really large body of research on purposes within legal scholarship, where people are asking, what are the purposes of laws? Like if we have a particular law, how can we figure out what the purpose of that law is? And especially, what downstream consequences will that purpose judgment have for questions about legal interpretation? So if we think about purposes of laws, what importance should that have for questions about legal decision making? But then completely separately from that, there's also been a huge body of research on purposes within psychology. So here people are just concerned not with purposes of laws, but with purposes of ordinary physical objects, like the purpose of a knife, the purpose of a lamp, the purpose of a stapler. What are these things for? And how do judgments about these kinds of purposes have downstream consequences in our cognition? Although there's been tons of research in each of these two areas kind of separately, these two areas have been more or less kind of pretty much completely siloed off from each other. So there's lots known about purposes in law, there's lots known about purposes in human cognition, but there really hasn't been too much interaction between these two fields. And what we're trying to do in the talk today is to really bring these two fields together to show how research on in empirical research in psychology on how people think about purposes can have real important implications for studies in the legal scholarship about the role of purpose in legal interpretation. So first of all, what is the role of purpose in legal interpretation? So here, I want to start with a sort of really classic example. So suppose we have a law, and the law says no vehicles are allowed in the park. Now we're trying to interpret this law. We're trying to figure out which things does this law saying are impermissible. So it's pretty clear that if someone tried to drive a car through the park, that would be violating the law. It's pretty clear that if someone wanted to go through the park in their sneakers, that wouldn't be violating law, it would just be totally in keeping with the law. But then there are other cases that might seem a little bit more complicated. Like suppose someone wants to go through the park in a skateboard, or suppose someone has like a kid with like a toy truck, and that kid with a toy truck wants to go through the park. Or suppose we're just thinking of putting a statue in the park to commemorate a war. And so we're thinking maybe it would be helpful to put into this park a full-blown tank just to sort of commemorate the struggles in a certain war. Then we could ask, do any of these things, do each of these things violate the law? These are very difficult questions. And within the field of interpretation theory, there have been all sorts of different views about how to answer these questions. How we could take a simple rule like no vehicles in the park and then apply it in these more complicated cases. But although there are many different views about these things, one of them in particular that's received a lot of attention is that we should be thinking about these questions in terms of purposes. So we should be trying to think in some way, what's the purpose of this law? So for example, if we take this case, no vehicles in the park, maybe we could think, what was the purpose of the law that said no vehicles are allowed in the park? And then if we think about all these different kinds of cases, maybe we can get some insight into how to apply the law to those cases by thinking about this question of purpose. So for example, suppose we're trying to figure out whether putting a tank into the park to commemorate the struggles in a war would violate this law. Maybe instead of trying to figure out then what is the meaning of the English word vehicle, we could do that by trying to think, what is the purpose of this law? And then if we thought, what is the purpose of this no vehicles in the park law? Maybe that could give us some insight into whether we should consider putting a tank into the park to be a violation of the law. So as some of you may know, our co-author Guilherme and his team, including Noel and Ivar, have done lots of really exciting research on this topic. And a lot of this research has been concerned with the question, what do people actually normally do when they're trying to figure out whether something violates a rule? Do they normally figure it out in terms of purposes? Do they normally figure it out in terms of some other way? For example, using the notion of the text itself and thinking about the semantic interpretation of these words. And there's been a whole stream of research coming out of this group in Brazil on this topic. But today we're going to be talking about a question that's in some way maybe prior to those questions. So it's not about the question, how do people interpret rules and do they use purpose to interpret the rules? It's just the question, how do they figure out what the purpose of something even is in the first place? So say you just have some law and you're just trying to figure out what is the purpose of this law? Independently of whether you use that judgment of purpose in legal interpretation, there's just a question, how do people figure out what the purposes of laws are? And within existing research in legal scholarship, there are these two quite different views about how people do that. So one view says the way you do it is through a kind of historical inquiry. You're going to go back to the time when the law was first passed, and then you're going to ask the question, what was the original intention of the legislature in passing this law? So what was the legislator trying to do at that time in passing the law? Maybe the law was passed in 1877. You want to figure out what was going on in 1877. What was the legislature trying to do when the legislature passed this law in 1877? Another view, a very different view, sometimes called objective purposes, or we're going to call moral purposes, says that when you're trying to figure out the purpose of a law, the way you're going to do it is not by engaging in a historical inquiry about the original intention of the legislature, but rather by engaging in a moral inquiry. So you're going to look at what this law says, and you're going to ask, what are the kind of moral principles that could kind of best justify this law? So in the case of no vehicles in the park, the original intentions view would say, go back to the time when people first passed the no vehicles in the park law and see what was the goal of the legislature in passing that law. In the moral view, you would say, you're just considering the law right now, and you're asking, what are the moral principles right now that would best justify this claim, the claim that we should actually have no vehicles in the park? So in today's talk, we're going to be adopting a really different kind of approach to this traditional question. So we're trying to figure out how should we think about purposes? What does it even mean for something to have a purpose? We're going to adopt a really different approach to that, one that's a little bit different from what's going on in most existing work within interpretation theory. And broadly speaking, I would say it's an approach that's pretty familiar from existing work in experimental jurisprudence. So it's going to be similar to, for example, the approach that Tobia uses in his work on the reasonable person, or that Summers uses in her work on consent, or that Canera uses in his work on intentional action. And broadly what that approach is that if we want to understand how a particular concept is used in the legal domain, how this kind of legally important concept is used when we're trying to think about laws, we can get some insight into it by thinking more broadly about the use of the concept, by thinking about the use of the concept outside the domain of law, and then getting some insight into how the concept is used in this broad sense, and then trying to apply that to the case of the law in particular. So for example, if you look at Tobia's work on the reasonable person, insofar as it plays a role in, for example, in negligence law, he starts out by doing systematic research on the notion of the reasonable applied to things that have no legal significance. So like, what's a reasonable amount of TV to watch in a day and so forth. And then once he develops this theory about the concept of the reasonable, just quite generally, then he's able to apply that theory to the concept of a reasonable person and really get some important insight into what's going on in tort law. So we're going to be taking that very same approach, but we're going to be applying it now to the concept of purpose. So the thing we really want to understand, the legal question we want to understand, is the purposes of laws. Like for example, suppose there is a law, and the law says that you're not allowed to go into a certain place. It says, no people are allowed to pass through this border. Then we could ask, what is the purpose of that law? What criteria should we be using in order to assess purposes for this law? But it might be helpful in thinking about that question to just try to look really broadly at how people apply the notion of purposes to things other than laws. So take a case that's really similar to that law, but doesn't involve a law, but instead involves a physical object. So imagine that instead of a law that says you can't go over a certain border, there's just a physical wall that prevents people from going over that border. So the wall is just like a physical object, but although it's a physical object and the law is a law, they're playing very similar roles in our lives. The law says you can't go through this border. The wall just physically prevents people from going through the border. When it comes to the physical wall, we can now ask the question, what is the purpose of this physical object? What is the wall for? What's the purpose of the law? And we can sort of explore that question in this larger domain, the domain outside of law, just thinking about physical objects. Maybe we can use that to get some really interesting insights into the question about the purposes of laws. So if we want to do that, we can turn to this vast body of existing research in psychology on how people think about purposes of physical objects. So in that research, there's been tons of work on all sorts of different topics. We're not going to be talking about all of that work. Instead, we're just going to be zeroing in on one particular topic in psychology of purposes, and that is the topic of the criteria people use when they're trying to determine whether something has purpose. So suppose you just have a physical object like the wall or a knife or some gloves or whatever physical object it is. How do you determine which thing is the purpose of that object? What is the object for? And what criteria do people use to determine whether something really counts as the purpose? So as we noted before, within legal scholarship, there are these kind of two main views about purposes. One saying purposes have something to do with the original intentions, the actual intention for which something is created, and the other saying that purposes have something to do with morality. And I think it might be helpful just to look at existing psychological work on one of those two things, existing psychological work on original intentions and whether the way to determine what something's purpose is to look at the original intention for which it was created. Sort of illustrating some of this body of research, I think it might be helpful to look at a study from Sarah Ju and colleagues that was a recent paper. So in this study, the question is, do people actually make judgments about what something's purpose is by looking historically at the original intention for which it was created, or do they do it by looking at the current time of what it's actually being used for now? So in this study, participants were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, they were told that a certain purpose was actually the purpose for which a certain object was originally created. It was the original intention in creating this object. So for example, in one of the vignettes, participants were told there are these metal tubes, and these metal tubes were originally created to make music when the wind blows. And then they were told, but now, people took the metal tubes and they started using them for a different purpose. They're now using those metal tubes as straws to drink beverages from. And then they're just asked about the original thing. So they're asked, is it right to say that the metal tubes are for making music when the wind blows? People judge this on a scale from 1 to 7. In the other condition, things were just reversed. So participants were asked about the purpose, which is the purpose that it's being used for now, not the purpose it was originally created for. So in this condition, participants would be told something like, there was this object, and it was originally created so that people could drink beverages from it. But then people took that object, and instead of using it to drink beverages, they started doing this other thing. They just hung it up and used it to make music when the wind blows. And then they were said, okay, consider this object. What would you agree? Would you agree that the metal tubes are for making music when the wind blows? So that the metal tubes are for the thing that wasn't their original purpose, but it is the thing they're being used for right now in the actual current practice we have. If you look at the results, what you find is that there's certainly not a tendency for people to privilege the original purpose, the original intention, over the current practice. And in fact, there's a small but significant effect whereby people actually privilege the current practice over the original intention. So people are actually tending to choose, when they have a conflict between what it was originally used for and what's being used for now, they tend to choose whatever it's being used for now. So coming back to the sort of question that we faced, we see that there was this idea in legal scholarship of these two different possible things that could influence purpose judgments. One is morality, the other is original intentions. This study that we're just talking about doesn't explore morality, it just doesn't ask about that question at all. It asks whether people make judgments about purpose using this criteria of original intentions. And what it suggests is that basically people aren't using that as their main criterion. If anything, they're sort of more privileging current practice, how people actually, as a matter of fact, use the object right now over how it was what was originally created for, the original intention of people creating. Okay, although we've discovered something about that, a question still remains about whether there's any impact of this other factor of morality. So if holding all other things equal, will we see an effect whereby people are more likely to see something what an object's really for if it's something morally good than if it's morally bad? Within existing research in psychological literature, we don't know of anything that has studied this at all. But of course, it seems like existing research has shown that many different kinds of judgments are affected in surprising ways by morality. So an obvious hypothesis would be that people's purpose judgments are affected not just by present practice, but also by morality. But again, this is something that hasn't been researched yet, something we want to find out in the present studies. So with that, I'm just going to sum up the research questions that we have for you today. So there are two basic things we want to understand. One thing we want to understand is the relationship between judgments about physical objects and their judgments about laws. Do people ascribe purposes to these two things in different ways? Do they have a sort of distinctive way of ascribing purposes to laws that's different from the way they ascribe purposes to physical objects? Or are they just using some kind of domain general criterion that whatever thing they use to describe purposes to a physical object, like say a wall, they use that exact same thing to ascribe purposes to a law. Like say a law that says that you can't go into a certain place. The second kind of question we want to know is, for each of those things, physical objects and laws, what criteria do people use in order to figure out what its purpose is? Do people base it on this historical question about the original intentions for which the thing was originally created? Do they base it on current practice, the actual facts about how it's being used right now? And do they base it on morality? So there could be an effect of all three of these things. There could be effect of any one of them. There could be effect of two and so forth. We just want to figure out what the answer to that question is. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Guilherme.
Great, thank you, Josh. Let me share my screen now. All right, can you see it?
Yes.
Good. All right, yeah. Okay, so now the thing that I'm going to do is to run through the 4 studies that we ran to address these 2 research questions, and to then discuss a little bit what are our main findings and some of the implications that we draw from them. So our very first study used this complicated 2x2x4 mix design. And I think that the best way to get a sense of what we were trying to do with this study is to just ignore the last factor, the within subjects manipulation, and then run through all of the conditions in one single scenario. So let's do that with the mind scenario. Lord Bacon was an aristocrat who lived in a mansion in the middle of a very large estate. Neighboring the estate lived several poor families. The poor families often walked through the property. One day, Lord Bacon discovered a landmine while walking through his property. Although the mine didn't explode, several other mines which were planted during World War II were later found on the estate. And with this in mind, Lord Bacon built a wall around his property, aiming to protect poor people from accidents involving the mines. The wall was successful, as no accidents with mines ever occurred. Over the years, Lord Bacon became prejudiced against poor people. The sight of poor people walking across his fields was repulsive to him. He began using the wall as a way to allow only nobles inside his property. And he announced this to close friends, saying, "I don't care at all about protecting poor people from accidents involving the mines. All I care about is allowing only nobles inside." And the wall was successful as only nobles entered the property. So this is the basic structure of our vignettes for study 1A. The idea is that we have this very first paragraph that just introduces some context. And then we have some situation at time 1, and the situation changes somehow at time 2, right? After reading one of the combinations of conditions, participants were presented with a DV, and the DV was always introduced with this brief paragraph. 2 friends familiar with the story had a heated debate about the purpose of the wall. One of them said the purpose of the wall is clearly to protect poor people from accidents involving the mines, while the other rejoined, even though Lord Bacon is using the wall for this now, that's not at all what it is really for. The purpose of the wall is to allow only nobles inside the property. And then people rated their agreement using a 7-point Likert scale with the statement that each of the 2 candidate purposes was the purpose of the wall, right? Either the purpose of the wall is to protect poor people from accidents, or the purpose of the wall is to allow only nobles inside the property. So that's the base scenario, and that's the structure of the scenario. Then the things that we manipulated, like the very first thing that we did to address the first research question that Josh just raised, was to manipulate whether the thing that was put in place was an artifact, as the physical wall that we just read about, or if it was a rule, right? So in this case, if we highlight things in blue here, we say that Lord Bacon built a wall around his property, and it is the wall that is first successful at avoiding accidents and then successful at allowing only nobles inside. In the alternate condition, instead of building a wall, Lord Bacon created a rule that fined trespassers, and it is now the rule that is successful first at avoiding accidents and then at allowing only nobles inside the property. The second manipulation that we did, and that's to get at Josh's second research question, was to manipulate whether the situation, like the purposes improved or whether they deteriorated. So right now we're looking at the deterioration condition, where we start out with this morally good purpose, and then this over time we substitute the morally good purpose with a morally bad purpose. And that's like visually communicated by the colors blue and red here. And in the other condition, the only thing that we did really was to shift those around. So what's now occupying the middle paragraph will become the last paragraph, and vice versa, right? So now instead of beginning like concerned with poor people because of the mines, Lord Bacon starts out prejudiced against poor people, and over the years, instead of becoming less compassionate, he becomes more compassionate towards poor people, and that's what drives his change of heart with regards to the purpose of the wall or of the roof. All right, so very briefly, what are the predictions that we have about this study 1A? So the very first prediction relating to the first research question that Josh raised is that there will be no differences between the way people attribute purposes to rules and to objects. In other words, the very first manipulation, it shouldn't have an effect because we are hypothesizing that these two kinds of purpose attribution judgments use the same sort of criteria. With regards to the second manipulation, I think we have three very different predictions as well. So if we go with the original intentions view, the prediction is that whatever occupies the middle paragraph, whatever is the purpose at time one, at the time that the rule was created or that the wall was built, that's going to be the purpose of the rule, regardless of whether it is morally good or morally bad. If we go to the moral purposes view, the prediction would be that it doesn't matter if it's in the middle paragraph or in the very last paragraph. All that matters is whether it is morally good or morally bad. After all, the task of devising purposes is the task of finding the best justification for the rule that's possible. And then finally, if we go with the current practice view, we would predict that people would prefer the paragraph that occupies the last position, right? It's the whatever purpose is described in the very last paragraph, that's the purpose of the rule, regardless of whether it is morally good or morally bad. So those are the predictions that we make. Looking at the results, let's first focus only on the first row here. So the first row describes the results for artifacts, for physical objects. In that case, what we might see looking at the x-axis is that people prefer the purpose supported by current practice over the purpose supported by original intentions. So we might see that those points to the left are overall, the distribution is higher up than the points to the right. And that pattern is the same whether we're looking at morally bad purposes or at morally good purposes. The other thing that we notice is that if we compare the leftmost column to the rightmost column in the first row, we don't see any sort of a difference, right? Which is to say that morality didn't influence judgments of whether something counted as the purpose of the artifact here. So this is the first finding. Current practice seems to be more predictive of purpose attribution judgments than original intentions. The second finding is that morality doesn't matter. And finally, if we compare the first row with the second row, we might see that the patterns are strikingly similar, right? Everything that I just said with relationship to the very first row regarding purpose attribution to physical objects remains the same with regards to the second row with purpose attribution to rules, right? So here we got this very clear effect that current practice seems to be the most important thing. Morality doesn't seem to matter much, and there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between the purpose attribution to physical objects and to rules. Now, that's striking. As Josh mentioned, if we go to the legal literature about statutory interpretation or about purposivism, what we will see is a lot of focus on original intentions and a lot of focus on moral purposivism, and basically no mention of current practice purposivism. So like one of the things that crossed our minds is perhaps that's a lawyers only thing. So perhaps if we go to lawyers instead of going to lay people, we will find out that they are actually employing these different sorts of strategies. Instead of looking at current practice, perhaps lawyers are looking at moral purposes and they are looking at the original intentions of lawmakers. And that's why the legal literature is so chock full of these other views and it's so silent on the current practices view. So the thing that we tried to do was to replicate basically the same design, but instead of recruiting people from MTurk, we recruited Brazilian lawyers. So we went to reviewers from a law review journal in Brazil. So the only difference with regards to design was that instead of having a 2x2 between subjects design, this time we only changed whether the rule was improving or deteriorating, but we didn't include physical objects because if there is to be a difference between the way that lawyers and lay people think about purpose attribution, it is much more likely to arise in the domain of rules than in the domain of physical objects. So that's the rationale for simplifying the design in this way. Here are the results. The plot is a little bit different, but the results are basically the same. Now, in the x-axis, we are plotting whether the purpose was morally bad or morally good. And again, we might see that there's not much of a difference between the distributions on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. But if we look at the criteria, the sort of purpose that is supported by current practice versus the purposes that are supported by original intentions, those are the red dots and the blue dots. We will see that the red dots are consistently higher up than the blue dots. So in other words, with lawyers, just as with lay people, current practice purposivism seems to be the way to go. In other words, lawyers and lay people in these sorts of situations seem to prefer whatever the purpose, the rule is currently being used for as the reason to go with, to attribute purpose. All right, so for our next study, the thing that we tried to investigate was, well, we detected this very strong effect of current practice purposivism, but we now want to test a situation where current practice purposivism is out of the picture. So when the only available options are original intentions and moral purposivism, which one prevails among lay people and among lawyers? So to test this, we designed a new study that follows a 2x2x4 mixed design. And again, I think the best way to go about is to completely ignore the last thing, the scenario manipulation, and to just look at one scenario and run through the variations in the other two factors. So now we're going to read the housing scenario. The City Council of Santa Cruz, a city in Brazil, decided by unanimous vote to institute strict housing regulations. A number of slums were forming in the city's hillsides, and the bill mandated the removal of all hillside houses and the prohibition of further development on the hills. Although every single one of the 50 city councilors supported the bill, different groups of lawmakers voted for this law for very different reasons. 30 lawmakers voted for the bill because they wanted to protect the poor people living in the slums from landslides, which is something that often takes place in Santa Cruz's hills. The remaining 20 councilors supported the bill because they wanted to increase the value of the land near Santa Cruz's downtown, which was depreciating as a result of the slums. Both outcomes were partly accomplished, and that last paragraph is very important. Now that the law is in effect, courts and legal scholars are inquiring about what is the purpose underlying it. After all, the purpose of a rule is often used in a legal setting to decide whether someone is legally liable. So the reason why we introduced this very last paragraph was to make it especially salient to lay people that purpose attribution isn't like simply something that is normatively inert, that is something that is often used in a decision-making setting as an aid, right? So here's the main manipulation that we did. In this specific version of the vignette, we have the majority of lawmakers voting for the law for a good purpose, right, to protect people from landslides. And we have the minority of lawmakers voting for the law for the morally suspect reason of increasing the value of land near Santa Cruz's downtown. We're not taking a stance that like increasing the value of land is necessarily bad, but if moral purposivism means that you ought to select the best moral reasoning, the best moral purpose that a law can have under the light of political morality, then we would argue that you would always go with the blue one instead of the red one, right? And our manipulation was very simply whether the majority supported the morally good purpose or whether they supported the morally bad purpose. So in the other condition, we had 30 lawmakers voting to increase the value of the land and 20 lawmakers voting to protect poor people from landslides. Now, the other manipulation that we had related to the DV, half of the participants rated whether the purpose of the law was to increase the value of the land, while the other half rated whether the purpose of the law was to protect the poor people from landslides. All right, predictions here. Again, first to emphasize, now current practice purposivism is out of the picture because there isn't any current practice surrounding this rule that was just enacted, right? So right here we have a pure conflict between original intentions purposivism and moral purposivism. Original intentions purposivism would say that it doesn't matter whether the purpose is supported by morality or not. All that matters is whether it is the purpose intended by the majority of lawmakers. After all, we're talking about a collective intention, and the way to ascertain collective intention in that sort of scenario, according to legal scholars in the original intentionalism tradition is to look at the majority, right? On the other hand, if you are on the camp of moral purposes, your prediction would be completely different. It would be that it doesn't matter whether a purpose is supported by the majority or by the minority. All that matters is whether the purpose is itself morally good or not, right? And you should prefer the purpose that is morally good. Here are the results. Now on the x-axis, we have whether the purpose is supported by the majority or the minority. And here we can see like a very clear effect whereby people tend to agree that the purpose supported by the majority is the purpose of the rule to a larger extent than they do when the purpose is supported by the minority. And when we compare like the red dots and the blue dots, we see no difference whatsoever, right? Or a very, very small and non-significant difference between morally bad purposes and morally good purposes. Again, one possible objection to this is that perhaps lawyers think about this in a different way. After all, we're again finding that moral purposivism has no explanatory purchase with regards to ordinary intuition. So perhaps it does have some purchase with the ordinary intuitions of lawyers. So we again went to Brazilian lawyers. This is the lay people data again, just to emphasize the differences. Now here amongst lawyers, we also detect a preference for the purposes supported by the majority. That's the comparison along the x-axis. But we also see a significant influence of moral valence, right? So if we look at red dots and blue dots in this plot, we might see that blue dots are systematically higher up than red dots. And that might be highly consequential. If we focus on purposes that are supported by the minority, for instance, we might see that mean judgments fall below the midpoint when the purpose is morally bad and above the midpoint when the purposes are morally good. So that might be consequential in a legal setting where they're trying to adjudicate about the rule. All right, so these are the 4 studies and the results. Let me just run by the findings, talk a little bit about the implications, and then we'll start the debate. So first finding is that the criteria people use to attribute purposes to rules and the criteria they use to attribute purposes to physical objects seem to be the same, right? So answering Josh's first research question, we would say that at least according to the data that we collected, when we match like a rule and a physical object with the same sorts of purposes, people don't seem to be employing different criteria to attribute purposes to one or the other. And that might be really important when we're trying to answer new questions about legal purposivalism, and I will give an illustration of that in a second. The second finding is that the way in which they are similar is that purpose attribution is mostly shaped by current practice. So in our first design, studies 1A and 1B, when all sorts of different theories were viable, current practice purposivalism exerted a much larger influence than any of the other 2 factors that we tested. And that might be really consequential to legal scholarship, especially because, as we mentioned, current practice purposivalism isn't really a view that has elicited a lot of legal scholarship. So there's lots of legal scholarship on original intentions. There are lots of legal scholarship on moral purposivalism, but there is almost no legal scholarship that investigates current practice purposivalism in deep. And that's problematic because several aspects of current practice purposivalism are underdeveloped, right? So for instance, whose practice is it? In our vignettes, we conflate like the rule maker with the rule applier, and we show that this one person changed their minds over time, but like that's not the prototypical case. The prototypical case, as Josh was mentioning, is like a law that was promulgated in 1877 and is now enforced by a completely different group of people. Is this sort of change of practice enough to like recommend a new purpose according to current practice purposivalism? That's very much an open question that our data cannot answer. And the other question is, what exactly is practice here picking out? Is it just a matter of behavioral regularities? If people start treating the law as having this new practice, that's enough? Even if no one has the further beliefs that this ought to be the case, or do we need some combination of behavioral regularities and intention. Just to illustrate this case in a more concrete way, imagine two facts about a given criminal law. The first fact is that officials are using the statute to disproportionately persecute people of a particular ethnic group. And the second fact is that none of the officials justify their actions with reference to ethnicity. Instead, they talk about preventing violence. Now, here's the question. Which of those is the purpose singled out by current practice purposivist? Answering this question necessitates taking a stance with regards to what exactly is practice. If practice is just behavioral regularities, then the purpose of this rule, according to current practice purposivism, would be to persecute people of a particular ethnic group. But if instead the current practice has to do with like the mental states of the officials, then the purpose is to prevent violence instead. But it could also be the case that it is some combination of both, there are several possible options defined by these two factors. Now, one interesting thing that follows from our very first finding is that if we're right in assuming that purpose attribution to laws and purpose attribution to physical objects involve the same sort of mechanism and the same sort of criteria, we can look at other studies that did not investigate purpose attribution in the realm of laws, but did investigate purpose attribution in the realm of physical objects to try to answer this question. So for instance, Josh mentioned this study by Zhu and colleagues that studied the psychology of attributing purposes to these metal tubes. And one interesting feature of that specific study is that they did, in one of their studies, disentangle between the behavioral regularities and the recognition bit, the bit that has to do with mental states. So here is the way they did it. Some people received this first prompt. Actually, everybody in the town used the metal tubes as wind chimes. If you saw a metal tube like this around town, chances are it was being used as a wind chime. And of course, the alternative version is that nobody used the metal tubes as wind chimes and it was not being used as a wind chime. And the second factor that has to do instead of behavioral regularities with the mental states would say something like, in fact, everybody in the town agreed that the tubes should be used as wind chimes. And if you ask someone at random what the metal tubes were, virtually everybody would say that they were wind chimes. Or again, so they treated these two things as cross factors, in that it could either be the case that you didn't have behavioral regularities and you didn't have the recognition, or that you had one or the other, or both of them at the same time. And their findings, like surprisingly, at least to me, were that these two factors influence purpose attribution judgments in an additive manner, right? If like one possible view that you could have is that either one of those two things is not enough. You need both, right? So they are individually necessary and jointly sufficient to shape current practice. That would entail an interaction effect, and that's not what they find. What they did find was this two main effects of behavioral regularities and of recognition. So one suggestion that I would like to make is that one way to make inroads into these open questions about current practice purposivalism is to look at data like this one and extrapolate back to legal philosophy. So one thing that we could say is that the most likely hypothesis with regards to current practice purposivalism in law is also that those two things, behavioral regularities on the one hand and recognition on the other hand, would have this sort of additive effects in that each is sufficient to bring agreement that the current practice supports that purpose a little bit higher up. Josh, do you want to add anything about this study since you were involved? All right, so that's just some food for thought. I thought it would be fun to like illustrate one of the open questions regarding current practice purposivalism and like take the opportunity to show how the conjunction of these two first findings might lead to progress, even without any new studies, right? We can just look at this vast literature regarding purpose attribution to physical objects in cognitive science, and we can use that to answer some new questions about law, given that this very first finding is true. Finally, our last main finding is that lawyers diverge from lay people in that they use morality as a criteria to attribute purposes under at least certain conditions, right? So that's the finding that contrasts studies 2A and 2B. I think this is important, but one of the main implications of this last finding is kind of in tandem with the things that I'm mentioning in this slide. So one thing that we could conclude is that if you think that legal concepts ought to track ordinary use, for instance, because of the requirements of publicity, then you have good reason to prefer current practice proposalism. So we just showed some data to the effect that ordinary people, when they're interpreting rules, they are more likely to think that the purpose of the rule is whatever it is currently being used for. And if you think that you have strong reasons to give preference to the folk conceptions, like the ordinary interpretation of a law, then you have good reasons to favor current practice proposalism as a normative theory in legal interpretation. However, there are certain features of legal thought that make it distinctive and that could allow proponents of either original intentions propositivism or moral propositivism to like keep steady in their normative commitments. So for instance, someone who prizes original intentions propositivism very deeply could justify their stance by reference to legislative supremacy or some of those ideas. So the idea is that we ought to have some sort of separation of powers whereby lawmakers make law and judges judge what the law is, but they cannot make new law, right? And one of the ways that you can make sure that they are not making new law is by having they attribute purposes by reference to original intentions. So even though it is true that this detracts from the overall goal of publicity, it is still the case that we ought to give preference to original intentions propositivism in that domain because of the importance of deferring to the legislative supremacy. Alternatively, if you're a moral propositivist, one thing that you could do is say, well, yeah, that's true. One of the rule of law values is publicity, but the reason why people value publicity is to ensure that they will have like substantively morally good outcomes. And when you are preferring moral propositivism over current practice propositivism, the thing that you are doing is much more conducive to achieving morally good results than the other option. So basically what we want to say here is that these results, given the importance of publicity, are important to the normative discourse, but they are not decisive, right? Like other sorts of outlooks towards propositivism are still perfectly defensible. It's just that they need to deal with the like fact that ordinary intuition seems to favor current practice propositivism instead of any of the other two alternatives. And the fact is that current scholarship simply doesn't do that. All right, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm eager to hear what you all think about it.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Guillaume and Josh.